The world was at war in the 1930s, late 1930s and early 40s. The bloodshed was already enormous by the time the U.S. was drawn into the fight in 1941. We fought alongside the other Allied forces against the Axis powers, which eventually, one by one, were forced to surrender. In 1943, Italy surrendered, but the war continued. Finally, some real peace came to Europe, at least, when Germany surrendered in May 1945. The Japanese continued fighting, but finally and officially on September 2nd, 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri, they officially surrendered too, and the final battle of the World War was over as it came to an end. That Missouri battleship had seen considerable action in the Pacific. That's why it was chosen, as History.com reports it, but also they added it was named after then President Truman's native state, Go Missouri. The History Channel tells more about the big day. In this country, people waited for the official word to come over the radio. Then President Truman finally gave that news at 7 p.m., and it led to widespread celebrations nationwide. It was New York City where music and dancing broke out in the streets of Little Italy. Confetti made of scraps of cloth rained down in the Garment District, and in Times Square, 2 million people packed into 10 blocks to express their jubilation. The New York Times described that the metropolis exploded its emotions, harnessed for the most part during the day with atomic force, describing the victory roar that lasted for 20 minutes after the announcement flashed across the electronic ticker. There was a 2-day celebration around the country. Sadly, not all were peaceful. New Bedford, Massachusetts, and San Francisco, California, for example, saw violence where lots of damage was done. 1,000 were injured and 11 people lost their lives. But for the most part, across the country, there were peaceful celebrations that captured everyone's attention. And everybody, it seemed, was celebrating that the fighting was over. And after all the bloodshed and death across the globe, finally peace reigned for now. And the iconic photograph of the soldier kissing the nurse in Times Square, bending her backwards, is forever etched in our minds. Even if we didn't live it, we've seen it, and it reminds us what real, heartfelt peace was like. What do you do when it's time to celebrate? How do you express great gratitude after loss and tragedy and death? How do you welcome peace? What do you do to thank God for His mercy, for hope, for life? In the Scriptures, after 70,000 Israelites died from the plague that originated in the sword of the angel of God because of David's sin, and surely the people's too, at the place where the dying stopped, right there at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, that's where David was instructed to buy the plot of ground, to build the altar, to do the sacrificing. And Araunah wanted to help David. He was willing to give David everything he needed to celebrate, because he was celebrating too, and he offered David the threshing floor and the tools and the wood and the oxen, but David wouldn't take it. Not like that, not for free. His words, "I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." You gotta love that. The conviction. And it should make all of us reconsider what we call sacrifice, what we actually give to the Lord. Not just in money, but in things and time and self. Could we also say this morning, could we all raise a hand and say, yes, we have given generously. We love to give sacrificially. David paid for the plot, built the altar there, sacrificed offerings there, and to be specific about the timeline, the Scripture says, and that's when the plague stopped. God was merciful, God was pleased, God was honored, and we see the answer to Araunah's comment earlier to David, the one who had sinned greatly and brought all of this tragedy on his people. That's when he said something that you might miss if you're not careful. You might slide right past it, because when he's talking to David, he says, "May the Lord your God accept you." Interesting. Not so much may the Lord accept the offering, David, but may the Lord accept you, and obviously the Lord did. The miraculous fire from heaven that came down to consume the offering, as 1 Chronicles tells it, must have also, if you could see with spiritual eyes, must have also consumed David's great sin and guilt. And that's how 2 Samuel ends. And we're ready to put the chapter and the whole book to bed, but the whole story of David's not done yet. There's a little more to tell, so we've got a little more time in the coming weeks to tell just a little bit more of the story of David before we're done. That's in the Kings and the Chronicles, which we'll touch today. But just before we leave 2 Samuel, notice how chapter 23 begins. Just before the names of David's mighty warriors are listed, and some of them are given commentary, and even Uriah the Hittite, now dead, is listed there, included in that list. The chapter 23, verse 1, these are the last words of David. The last words of David. The inspired utterance of David, son of Jesse, the utterance of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, the hero of Israel's songs. A fitting description, but even the words that follow this shows that's not really the end, at least chronologically. But here is the writer of the story of David putting his words on paper, the words of the Lord in the mouth of David, and pointing to the end because David is almost at the end. This is where he's going to tell how the end goes. And David's going to get ready for the end. And the writer, as if David were speaking in himself, describes how the Spirit was always working through David. His words on my tongue, he says. The God of rock, the rock, speaking to him, telling him how to rule in righteousness in the fear of the Lord. Then he goes on to speak in language we may not fully grasp, but while speaking of himself, trying to understand the mercies of God and explain why God is doing this for him, he points to the Lord, as David always does, pointing to the Lord, explaining the praise in the previous chapter that we've already read. But back to the altar, back to the threshing floor. It was right there where the Lord had already determined this is where the altar will be. And so in 1 Chronicles 22, as it begins, it says, the house of the Lord God is to be here, David says, here, and also the altar of burnt offerings for Israel. 1 Chronicles 22 tells the rest of the story from here on. David's already understood from God that he was not the one to build the permanent house of the Lord, the temple. He wanted to do it, but it wouldn't be him. It would be built here, right here, Jerusalem, Mount Moriah. It might have been even his lifelong dream as soon as he could express it, but the Lord wouldn't allow him to do it. Kind of like Moses going to the mountain, seeing it, but not being able to get there. Too much battle in him, too many wars in him, too much blood on his hands. He couldn't, he wouldn't, his son would, but he could get the ball rolling. So David starts the process. He can't have the great honor of building it, but he will have the honor of preparing his son to get the job done and build it. So David, in some ways, rolls up his sleeve and gets to work as he gets the people ready to do the work. And he gets stone cutters. He provides iron for nails, bronze, more than you can weigh, cedar logs, more than you can count, and he tells the people why he's even doing this. 1 Chronicles 22, verse 5. My son Solomon, David says, my son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord should be of great magnificence and fame and splendor in the sight of all the nations. Therefore, I will make preparations for it. So David made extensive preparations before his death. David's not trying to be cruel here, just honest. My son's going to need some help. See, he's young and he's inexperienced and he can't do this by himself. And the house, it needs to be incredible, great, magnificent, with splendor and glory. So every person from every country sees it and says, wow, if that temple is like that, then God must be even greater. So he rallies the troops around his son and points them toward his son and points everybody to the Lord. And instead of acting like a spoiled child, as I see sometimes even in my own family, a child who may say, if I can't do that, I'm not playing. David doesn't take his marbles and go home. He starts getting to work, acts maturely. He starts helping people get ready for helping his son to help build the temple. And you got to admire that, watching a man prepare everybody around him to go on without him. I suspect you remember another man who did that in our recent history. It was a stormy night in Memphis, Tennessee, April 3rd, 1968. Despite the nasty weather, the people were packed into the Mason Temple building, and some nice things were said from the people up there at the pulpit. But it wasn't just the weather that was electric that night. The next speaker of the evening lit everybody on fire. His name was Martin Luther King Jr., and I hope you know why our schools were out Monday. Dr. King had already been to Memphis for the Sanitation Workers March, and it ended abruptly, really, because violence broke out, and the police started bloodying the marchers, and so they whisked Dr. King away to avoid injury, but then he got a bad rap for leaving, and they questioned his commitment in this nonviolent movement and figured maybe it's not even working at all. But he was determined not to walk away, but would walk again in the rescheduled event. So he came back to Memphis to help the city and the whole country determine that a man should still be treated like a man, even if his skin is darker than most. And I love that man, King. Didn't know him, of course, but wow. For what he said and what he did made our world a better place. I'm better because of him, and I admire him, how God used him in that effort. He'd already had these death threats that came across. The rumors were told. He knew it might happen. He figured the end of his days was coming. Even before that stormy night, one of his friends was saying he seems a little bit on edge. They watched him even in the room that night, and as the lightning struck and the thunder crashed and the shutters blew in and out, he would wince with each bang. But when he finally stood to speak, you could feel it. He spoke with resolve and conviction. He took the audience on a philosophical and geographical tour of history and Scripture and what might have happened and what did happen in the world and in the U.S. and right there in Memphis, and how God was working, and it was powerful. You can read it for yourself, drmartinlutherkingjr.com or wherever else you want to find it. But what would it be like to stand there and speak to a crowd knowing very well that his speech might be his last? He said in that speech near the end, some began to say that threats, talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? And if you know the rest of the story, then you know what happened the very next morning. The storm had passed. King came out on that nice day from the second-story balcony of the Lorraine Hotel. From his room, looked down in the parking lot, talking to a couple of his friends. And that was when one of the sick white brothers took a shot from a window across the way. James Earl Ray killed him. Didn't kill the dream, didn't kill the movement, but do you remember the last words he said in that speech? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter what happens to me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I love that conviction. I'm inspired by that faith. I'm changed, I think, by the way that he lived his life and how he died. David, the great king of Israel, is preparing those around him to go on without him too. This man of steel conviction and unbreakable faith is getting his house in order. He's preparing his son and the people that will surround his son to get to work now. And he's pointing to the end. And listen to what David does next and says next in verses 17 following. David ordered all the leaders of Israel to help his son Solomon. And he said to them, "Is not the Lord your God with you? And has he not granted you rest on every side? For he has given the inhabitants of the land into my hands, and the land is subject to the Lord and to this people. Now, devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. Begin to build the sanctuary of the Lord God, so that you may bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord and the sacred articles belonging to God into the temple that will be built here for the name of the Lord." David does what David does best. He reminds them what the Lord has been doing in history and for them. This land is yours. The enemy that were here and subdued you are now subdued, and the Lord, He is with you as He has always been with you. And He gives them this pep talk like a coach in the locker room, sending them out onto the floor or onto the field to win, to get the job done. And He says, now begin to build the sanctuary. Go ahead, get it done. And He's anxious to get the Ark of the Covenant right there in Jerusalem, where it ought to be. And He's almost giddy over knowing that the temple would someday be there, and all of it would be in honor of the name of the Lord, the name of the Lord. And as much as it may seem like David wants to do this for himself, you see his motives peeking through. Because this one is for the Lord. This is for the Lord. Well, I think there's a couple things to be inspired by and maybe to learn before we put this one to rest. First, just like David did, how about you? Do something productive for the Lord. Even when you can't do what you really want to do something. And maybe there's a dream within you to someday be a preacher or a teacher, an elder or a deacon, to be teaching a child about the Lord, to share the gospel with your neighbor. Maybe it's to be a missionary on a foreign land. Maybe it's something big, something great, something monumental, something eternal, something impressive. I don't know what it is. Probably it's good, but while you're dreaming of doing something great, how about just doing something? Don't forget what you're able to do while you're dreaming of things you could do. If David couldn't build it, he'd get everything ready for those who could build it, and that's what he did. We sometimes put great value on some jobs and then almost nothing on others. But somebody has to hold the other end of the measuring tape for the construction guy. Somebody has to hand the scalpel to the surgeon or the wrench to the mechanic. Somebody has to clean up the teacher's classroom after she's just inspired all of them to be great. And a whole lot of somebodies around here may not ever be an elder or a deacon or a preacher or a ministry leader, but somebody has to print the bulletins and sweep the floors and melt the ice and open the doors, set up the chairs and shake a hand, pour some grape juice and change a light bulb and clean the water in the baptistry, put new flowers on the stage and hold the baby, and the list goes on and on. So what are you doing? Please don't downplay the service that goes on around here and out there, because somebody has to do something while everybody else is dreaming of what really could happen. And when anybody does something, even a glass of cold water in honor of the Lord, please don't call it unimportant or insignificant. It may seem like that, but it is never anything but important and significant in just what God desires. So please, no matter what great things you aspire to do someday in the name of the Lord, today, just do what you can when you can't do what you want. Do something in honor of the name of the Lord today. And second, prepare those who are coming behind you. Get them ready for the end. Another king, this was in the New York Times back in 2007, this man, this soldier named First Sergeant Charles Monroe King, started writing to his son that he didn't get to spend much time with, a little boy, and it ended up being a 200-page journal in case he didn't make it back from Iraq, and that's what happened. Killed on October 14th that year when an improvised explosive device detonated near his armored vehicle in Baghdad. So as his son would grow up, all he would have was this, the memories, the words that his dad wrote down. And he wrote things like, never be ashamed to cry. I like that. No man is too good to get on his knee and humble himself to God. Follow your heart. Look for the strength of a woman. He tried to anticipate what his son might want to know from him. So he said, like, favorite team? I'm a diehard Cleveland Browns fan. Favorite meal? Chicken, fried or baked, candied yams, collard greens, cornbread. Childhood chores, shoveling snow, cutting grass. First kiss, 8th grade. And in neat blocks he wrote about faith and failure and heartache and hope, and he offered tips even on how to behave on a date and where to hide your money on vacation. He was also a black man, so he did feel discrimination at times, but he didn't feel the bitterness of it. And so he wrote to his son, it's not fair to judge someone by the color of their skin, whether they're raised this way or that, with their religious beliefs. Appreciate people for who they are and learn from their differences. He said, God blessed me above all I could imagine. I have no regrets. Serving your country is great. I hope all of you parents and grandparents are already taking this seriously, but you don't have to be married or have children to do this, because anybody that is important to you should know that they are important to you. Family, friend, neighbor, coworker, doesn't matter. Prepare them for what's coming next, because someday you won't be their neighbor. Someday you won't be at that job. Someday you won't be here. You won't be their friend. You won't be their family, because you won't be here at all. So what could you do even today, tomorrow, this week? Get people ready for the end. Point to the end and speak of it freely. It's coming. Did you know that? Your end is around the corner somewhere. My time is coming to a close, and I don't know when. But I will one day go the way of my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and everyone who has gone before me. Don't be shocked and don't be surprised. Don't let it sneak up on you. It's coming. And today you may be young or you may be old. You may think it's happening soon or it may not ever happen, but I promise you someday you'll be dead. And that doesn't need to scare you. It should motivate you. It should get you ready for that day, to do what needs to be done today and say what needs to be said. Get your house in order. I mean, practically speaking, get a little life insurance, get a will written, write some things down for your family so they know your wishes. Talk about your funeral. Talk about your dreams for your kids, for your neighborhood, for the country. Tell them what you want them to know, just like David did. And the greatest thing you can do for others, not just your family, the best thing you can say to them, the best thing you can push them to think about, is what David said to the leaders of Israel. Devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. So while you might be pushing your kids or grandkids or neighborhood kids or friends at school to do great things in school or in sports or in life, maybe you desire for them to grow up and marry well and do well and be successful. And maybe you pray for them to be safe, that they're taken care of, that they live long and enjoy all of their life. But there is no greater desire that you could have for them, the one that has eternal consequences, blessings that will follow them into eternity. Like this: devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. And just so you know today, I wish this for you too. Do you know Him? Are you seeking Him? Have you given your whole life to Him? Your heart and your soul and everything you are. Are you found today in Him? Have you died with Him, been united with Him, be counted worthy of Him? If not, do it today. And if this is my last opportunity to say anything to you because you never come back here, or I never see you again, or I don't live past today, then let me speak David's words to you too. And we'll close with this. Please, devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God above all else, and you will be blessed. Let's stand and sing. Come if you need to.